Listen, if you will, to the whisper of wind across frozen fjords, where the aurora borealis dances in sheets of green and gold above peaks that have witnessed the birth and death of gods. Here, beneath this eternal northern sky, where winter's breath never fully leaves the air and the very stones seem to hum with ancient power, we find ourselves drawn into stories that predate the written word, tales that were carved not into stone but into the collective memory of a people who understood that darkness and light are not opposites but partners in an eternal dance. The Norse knew something that our modern world has perhaps forgotten, that true wisdom comes not from avoiding the shadows, but from walking deliberately into them, from understanding that even gods, especially gods, carry within themselves the seeds of their own destruction. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of this moment, allow yourself to be transported to a realm where the line between hero and villain blurs like morning mist, where the gods themselves are flawed, desperate, and achingly human in their divine imperfection. In the great halls of Asgard, where golden mead flows like liquid sunlight, and the very walls echo with the laughter of immortals, there lurks an understanding that all things must end. The Norse called it Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, but it was more than mere ending. It was the acknowledgement that even in paradise, entropy whispers its inevitable song. This is not a tale of pure heroes conquering absolute evil, but rather a meditation on the price of wisdom, the weight of destiny, and the terrible beauty that emerges when even gods must face their darkest truths. Picture, if you can, the vast expanse of Midgard, our world, surrounded by the cosmic tree Yggdrasil, its roots delving deep into wells of memory and wisdom, its branches reaching toward realms beyond mortal comprehension. Upon this world tree, a great raven named Thought flies alongside his companion Memory, carrying news to the one who would know all things, even if that knowledge brings only sorrow. These ravens belong to Odin, the Allfather, a god whose hunger for wisdom has led him down paths that would terrify lesser beings, whose single eye has gazed into futures that fill even divine hearts with dread. And there, in the rolling thunder that follows lightning's flash, we hear the approach of Thor, the red-bearded thunderer whose hammer, Mjolnir, has shattered mountains, and whose strength has become both blessing and curse to a world that needs protection, but fears the protector as terrible power. Thor, beloved by mortals, friend to humanity, yet carrying within his mighty frame a darkness that few dare acknowledge, a weariness that comes from endless battle, from being forever the shield between civilization and chaos. These are not the sanitized gods of children's stories, but complex beings whose divinity amplifies rather than diminishes their flaws. They love and hate with cosmic intensity. They scheme and sacrifice with the weight of worlds upon their shoulders, and they face their destinies with a courage that is made more beautiful by its ultimate futility. In Norse mythology, heroism is not about winning. It is about standing firm in the face of inevitable defeat, about choosing to fight even when the outcome is already written in the stars. So settle deeper into this moment. Let the concerns of the day fade like distant thunder, and prepare to journey with me into the heart of Norse darkness, where we shall discover that sometimes the most profound truths hide not in the light, but in the spaces between shadows, in the pauses between heartbeats, in the silence that follows the last echo of divine laughter. The gods are waiting, and they have stories to tell that will linger in your dreams long after the telling ends. But what kind of wisdom requires such sacrifice? What truths are worth trading an eye to glimpse? What burdens do the gods carry that mortal shoulders could never bear? These questions hang in the cold northern air like breath made visible, and in seeking their answers we begin to understand why the Norse looked upon their gods not with simple reverence, but with a complex mixture of love, fear, and deep abiding sympathy. The wanderer with one eye. In the misty hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and day, there walks a figure that mortals have learned both to welcome and to fear. He appears as an old wanderer, his broad-brimmed hat pulled low to shadow features that have looked upon the face of time itself, his gray cloak trailing behind him like captured storm clouds. 2 ravens perch upon his shoulders, their black eyes reflecting knowledge too vast for any single mind to contain, and at his side walks an 8-legged horse whose hoofbeats echo with the rhythm of fate itself. This is Odin, though he wears many names: the Allfather, the hanged god, the lord of the gallows, the seeker of wisdom. Each title carries with it a shadow, a hint of the prices he has paid in his relentless pursuit of knowledge. For Odin is not content with the wisdom that comes naturally to gods. He craves the deeper truths, the hidden mysteries that lie beyond the veil of comfortable ignorance, and he has learned that such knowledge always demands payment in blood, in sacrifice, in the surrendering of things that can never be reclaimed. The most famous of these sacrifices occurred at Mimir's well, where, beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, flows water that contains the memory of all things that have been, and the shadowy outlines of things yet to come. Mimir, the wise giant who guards this sacred spring, had looked upon the approach of the Allfather with eyes that held neither welcome nor rejection, only the calm acknowledgement of inevitability. He knew what Odin had come seeking, and he knew to the price that wisdom demanded. Great Allfather, Mimir's voice had rumbled like water over ancient stones. You seek to drink from my well, to taste the waters that hold all knowledge. But wisdom is not freely given, especially to gods who already hold dominion over much. What are you willing to sacrifice for sight beyond sight, for knowledge beyond knowing? And Odin, standing at the edge of that sacred pool where starlight seemed to gather and dance beneath the surface, had not hesitated. His response came not as words, but as action, swift and terrible and final. Drawing the great knife that hung at his side, the blade that had tasted the blood of giants and the tears of gods, he pressed its point against his right eye, that eye which had gazed upon the beauty of newborn worlds and witnessed the death of ancient stars. The cut was clean, precise, devoid of drama, yet heavy with consequence. The eye fell into the still waters of Mimir's well with barely a splash, yet that small sound seemed to ripple outward through all the 9 realms, marking a moment when even the gods demonstrated that some knowledge is worth any price. As divine blood mingled with sacred water, Odin felt the first stirrings of the terrible wisdom he had purchased, visions cascading through his mind like dark waterfalls, showing him futures that filled his remaining eye with shadows that would never fully lift. He saw the death of Baldr, his beloved son, struck down by a dart of mistletoe through trickery and divine blindness. He witnessed the binding of Loki, the blood brother, whose loyalty would curdle into bitter hatred. He gazed upon Ragnarok itself, that final battle where he would face the great wolf, Fenrir, and find not victory but only the cold satisfaction of meeting his fate with open eyes. The knowledge burned through him like liquid fire, each revelation a small death. each prophecy a weight that settled upon his shoulders, like chains forged from inevitability itself. But perhaps most terrible of all was the understanding that came with this divine sight, that knowledge, even perfect knowledge, does not grant the power to change what must be. The gods, despite their might, despite their wisdom, despite their desperate love for what they have built, are as bound by fate as any mortal. They can see their doom approaching with crystalline clarity, can mark each step that leads toward catastrophe. Yet they cannot alter the path, cannot choose a different dance, cannot escape the roles that the universe has written for them. Rising from Mimir's well, water and blood still dripping from the hollow socket that would never again know sight, Odin had become something new, something more than he had been, yet also something diminished. The price of ultimate wisdom, he learned, is the loss of comfortable illusions, the death of hope's gentle lies, the terrible burden of seeing clearly in a world where clarity brings only sorrow. From that day forward, the ravens Hugging and Munine, thought and memory, became more than companions. They became extensions of his will to know, flying each day across all the worlds, returning each evening to whisper into his ear the secrets they had gathered. Through their eyes, he watched the slow unfolding of the prophecies he had seen reflected in Mimir's waters, each event falling into place with the precision of clockwork, each step bringing the gods closer to their predetermined end. The irony was not lost on him. This god who had traded an eye for sight had gained the ability to see everything except the one thing he most desired, a path away from the darkness that approached. The knowledge that flowed through him was absolute but powerless, complete but ultimately futile, like knowing the precise moment of one's death, yet being unable to prevent it. This was the shadow that would follow Odin through all his remaining days. The understanding that wisdom and despair are often the same thing seen from different angles. Yet still he sought more knowledge, driven now not by hope but by a compulsion deeper than reason. He learned the secrets of the runes by hanging himself from Yggdrasil's branches for 9 days and 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, sacrificing himself to himself in a ritual that would echo through the ages. He consulted with wise women and ancient spirits. He traveled to the lands of the dead and spoke with those who had passed beyond the veil. He gathered around himself the greatest heroes of Midgard, bringing them to Valhalla, not just to fight in the final battle, but to serve as witnesses to the great tragedy that he could see but could not prevent. And in quiet moments, when the weight of omniscience became too heavy to bear alone, Odin would find himself at the edges of Asgard, gazing out toward the darkness that lay beyond the light of the gods' realm, wondering if perhaps ignorance might have been, after all, a sweeter gift than the terrible clarity that now defined his existence. But such thoughts were luxuries he could no longer afford, for he was no longer merely Odin, the god he had become, Odin, the oracle, bound to his visions as surely as any mortal is bound to their need for breath, blood, oaths, and betrayals. The halls of gods echo, not only with laughter and the clash of celebration, but with whispers of deals made in shadow, of oaths sworn in blood that would bind the divine to courses of action that their wiser selves might have avoided. For Odin, in his relentless pursuit of wisdom and power, had learned that sometimes the greatest victories require the deepest betrayals, and that even gods must sometimes dance with darkness if they hope to serve the light. One such dance began in the realm of the giants, where dwelt 2 brothers named Fjalar and Galar, whose skill in brewing was matched only by their cruelty and cunning. These giants had committed a crime that resonated through all the 9 realms. They had murdered Kvasir, the wisest of all beings, a god born from the peace treaty between the Jir and Vanir, gods created from the mingled spit of both divine houses as a symbol of unity and shared wisdom. Kvasir had been beloved by all who knew him, for he possessed the rare gift of being able to answer any question posed to him, and he shared his knowledge freely, traveling between realms to teach and enlighten whoever sought understanding. His wisdom was not the cold, calculating intelligence that Odin had purchased with his sacrifice, but a warm, living knowledge that brought comfort and clarity to troubled minds. When word reached Asgard that this precious being had been slain, the grief of the gods was matched only by their rage. But Fjalar and Galar had not killed Kvasir in passion or madness. They had murdered him with calculated purpose, catching his divine blood in 2 jars and a kettle, mixing it with the finest honey to create a mead unlike any that had ever existed. This mead, born from wisdom's blood and sweetened with golden nectar, granted to whoever drank it the gift of poetry and profound knowledge. It was a treasure beyond measure, liquid enlightenment that could transform any being into a skald of unparalleled ability. Yet the giant brothers' cruelty did not end with murder. They soon found themselves hosts to Gilling, another giant, and his wife, and in their black hearts they devised new entertainment. They convinced Gilling to join them in a boat, claiming they wished to show him the beauty of the fjords. But once they were away from shore, they capsized the vessel. Gilling, who could not swim, drowned in the cold waters, while the brothers watched with satisfaction that spoke to depths of evil that even other giants found disturbing. When Gilling's wife learned of her husband's fate, her grief was so profound that her wails of sorrow echoed across the mountains, a sound so heartbreaking that it seemed to crack the very stones. The brothers, annoyed by her mourning, offered to show her the exact spot where her beloved had died. But as she walked through their doorway, they dropped a millstone upon her head, silencing her grief with brutal finality. This was the situation that came to Odin's attention, not through his ravens or his supernatural sight, but through the arrival of Suttungr Gilling's son, whose rage at his parents' murder burned hotter than the fires of Muspelheim. Suttungr had taken the giant brothers captive and was preparing to exact a vengeance that would make their crimes seem gentle by comparison. But Odin saw in this moment not just justice, but opportunity. The Allfather approached Suttungr with an offer wrapped in the language of righteousness, but rooted in divine pragmatism. He would help ensure that Fjalar and Galar received the punishment they deserved, but in exchange, Suttungr would give him custody of the mead they had brewed from Kvir's blood. It was, Odin argued, fitting that such a treasure, born from the murder of a god, should be placed in divine hands rather than remaining in the possession of murderers or their victims' kin. Suttungr, consumed by grief and rage, agreed to this bargain, perhaps not fully understanding the implications of what he was trading away. The giant brothers met their end in a manner that their crimes had earned, but the mead, that precious elixir of wisdom and poetry, passed into Suttungr's possession, and from there, according to their agreement, should have passed to Odin. But grief has a way of changing perspective, and when the time came to honor the bargain, Suttungr found himself unwilling to part with the mead that had cost his parents their lives. Instead, the giant hid the precious liquid deep within the mountain Hintbjörg, placing it under the guard of his daughter Gunla, and surrounding it with defenses that would daunt even the gods. But Odin had not gained his reputation as the most cunning of the Gear by accepting defeat when valuable knowledge lay within reach. If Suttungr would not honor their agreement, then the Allfather would take what was rightfully his through other means. What followed was a masterpiece of deception that would have impressed even Loki himself. Odin transformed his appearance, taking on the guise of a wandering laborer named Baldr, meaning evil worker, a name that would prove more prophetic than perhaps even he intended. In this disguise, he approached the farm of Bogi, Suttungr's brother, arriving at the height of harvesting season when extra hands were desperately needed. Bogi's 9 thralls were working in the fields, their scythes rising and falling in rhythm as they cut the grain, when the disguised Odin appeared among them with a whetstone of such remarkable quality that it sharpened their blades to an impossible keenness. The thralls, amazed at how easily their work became with properly sharpened tools, begged to purchase the whetstone, and Odin, with the generosity that marks the best deceptions, agreed to sell it to them. But as the thralls fought over who would own this marvelous whetstone, their struggle became heated, and in their desperation to possess it, they turned their newly sharpened scythes upon each other. By the time their conflict ended, all 9 lay dead in the field, their blood mixing with the grain they had been harvesting, and the whetstone had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. Bogi, arriving to find his workers dead and his harvest endangered, was approached by the helpful stranger who expressed sympathy for the giant Eslos and offered to perform the work of 9 men in exchange for simple compensation, a drink of the mead that his brother kept hidden in the mountain. It was, Baldr claimed, a reasonable trade, the labor of an entire season for a single taste of the legendary brew. Desperate and seeing no alternative, Bogi agreed, though he warned that his brother would never consent to sharing even a drop of the mead. This concerned Baldr not at all. He suggested they could surely find a way to obtain just a small portion without Suttungr's knowledge. It was, after all, only fair compensation for honest work. True to his word, the disguised Odin worked with the strength and skill of 9 men, bringing in Bogi's harvest in record time and with quality that exceeded anything the giant had seen before. But when the season ended and payment came due, the brothers' meeting went as Bogi had predicted. Suttungr refused absolutely to part with even a single drop of the mead, leaving Bogi in the uncomfortable position of being unable to honor his bargain with the worker who had saved his farm. It was then that Baldr suggested a solution that seemed reasonable to a giant whose conscience was already troubled by his inability to pay what he owed. If they could not obtain the mead through negotiation, perhaps they could find another way to access it. Surely Suttungr would not begrudge his brother and a loyal worker a small taste of something that existed in such abundance. All they needed was a way into the mountain where the mead was stored. Bogi, perhaps willfully blind to the implications of what he was agreeing to, helped the disguised god approach Hintbjörg under cover of darkness. Using an auger, they began to bore a hole through the mountain's stone heart, working in shifts through the long night until finally, as dawn approached, Bogi declared that they had broken through to the interior. But when Baldr blew into the hole to test whether it truly penetrated the mountain, stone chips flew back into his face, revealing his companion's deception. The truth was that Bogi, having second thoughts about betraying his brother's trust, had deliberately stopped short of breaking through, hoping to frustrate the stranger's plans, while still being able to claim that he had attempted to fulfill his bargain. But Odin had not spent centuries learning the arts of deception to be thwarted by such a simple trick. Forcing Bogi to continue their work, they finally created a passage that truly penetrated to the heart of the mountain. What happened next would be remembered in song and story for as long as gods drew breath. Transforming himself into a serpent, Odin slithered through the narrow passage they had created, emerging in the vast chamber where Gunla kept her lonely vigil over the mead that had cost so much blood to create. The giant maiden, isolated in her mountain prison, was perhaps more vulnerable to the charms of a handsome stranger than her father had anticipated. For 3 days and 3 nights, Odin remained with Gunla, and in those days he showed her a tenderness that may have been genuine or may have been the most skillful deception of all. She was beautiful in the way that only giants could be, with a beauty that was terrible and wild and touched with the raw power of the earth itself. In her eyes, he saw not just desire, but a loneliness that matched his own. The isolation that comes from being set apart by duty and circumstance, from the companionship that lesser beings take for granted. On each of those 3 nights, she allowed him to drink from one of the vessels that contained the mead of poetry, and with each draught, Odin felt the essence of Kvasir flowing through him, the murdered god's wisdom mixing with his own, creating a combination of knowledge and inspiration that elevated even divine consciousness to new heights. But Odin's purpose had never been to sip delicately at this treasure on the 3rd night. He drained all 3 vessels, completely consuming every drop of the mead in a feat of drinking that would have been impossible for any being less than a god. Then, with the stolen treasure burning like liquid fire in his divine veins, Odin transformed himself once again, this time taking the shape of an eagle, and burst from the mountain into the dawn sky. Behind him, Gunlo's cries of betrayal and rage echoed from the stone chamber. But he could not afford to look back, for Suttungr had discovered the theft and was pursuing him in his own eagle form, driven by a fury that made the mountain itself tremble. The chase that followed became the stuff of legend. 2 great eagles racing across the sky, while below them the 9 realms watched in wonder and terror. Odin's lead was small, and the weight of the mead he carried made his flight labored, while behind him Suttungr flew with the desperate strength of one who has lost everything. As they approached Asgard, the gods themselves gathered to watch this aerial battle, their faces tense with concern for their Allfather's fate. It was a race measured not in miles but in heartbeats, and as Odin crossed the threshold of Asgard's walls, he was forced to disgorge the mead into vessels that the other gods had hastily prepared. Most of the precious liquid was saved, becoming the source of inspiration for all true poets and skalds who would follow, but some small portion fell toward Midgard as Odin strained to complete his task before Suttungr could overtake him. This portion, scattered like divine rain across the mortal world, was said to be the source of mediocre poetry, the verse of those who possessed some small inspiration but lacked the full blessing of the gods. It was fitting, perhaps, that even in triumph, Odin's victory was not complete, that something of value was lost in the very act of preservation. But the greater tragedy was not what was lost in the escape, but what was sacrificed in the acquisition. Gunla, left alone in her mountain with the terrible knowledge of how thoroughly she had been deceived, became a figure of sorrow that even the giants mourned. Her love, freely given, had been exploited as surely as if it had been stolen at sword point, and the memory of those 3 days and nights would haunt her for all the long years that followed. Odin had gained the meed of poetry, ensuring that divine wisdom and inspiration would flow to those worthy of receiving it. But the price had been paid, not just in his own deception and risk, but in the breaking of an innocent heart, in the betrayal of trust that had been offered without reservation. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout his long existence. This willingness to sacrifice others' happiness, others' trust, others' love on the altar of what he perceived as the greater good. The mead of poetry became one of the great treasures of Asgard, dispensed carefully to those mortals and gods who showed themselves worthy of its gifts. But those who drank it were also drinking the memory of murder and betrayal, the bitter knowledge that even the most beautiful creations can be born from the darkest deeds. In the end, Kvasir's blood had been transformed not just into inspiration, but into a reminder that wisdom and treachery are often indistinguishable from each other, separated only by the perspective of the observer and the passage of time. Thor, the Thunderer, in shadow, where lightning splits the darkness and thunder rolls across the heavens like the footsteps of giants, there walks a god whose very presence changes the nature of the storm. This is Thor, the red-bearded Thunderer, whose hammer Mjolnir has never known defeat, whose strength has shattered mountains, and whose courage has stood as a bulwark between the civilized realms and the chaos that constantly threatens to consume them. Yet, for all the songs that celebrate his victories, for all the prayers that call upon his protection, there exists a shadow side to the thunder god that few dare acknowledge, a darkness that grows not from evil, but from the terrible weight of being forever the shield between order and annihilation. Picture Thor as he truly is, not the jovial hero of children's tales, but a being whose massive frame carries the burden of endless war, whose bright blue eyes have looked upon suffering that would break lesser minds, whose powerful hands have dealt death so often that even he has lost count of the lives they have taken. His red beard, which gleams like burnished copper in the light of Asgard's halls, is often matted with the blood of giants, and his clothes bear the stains of battles that have raged across all the 9 realms. The hammer Mjolnir, that legendary weapon forged by the dwarves in the heart of a dying star, is more than just a tool of war. It is an extension of Thor's will, a conduit for his rage, and perhaps most troubling of all, a constant reminder of his role as the destroyer of his people's enemies. The weapon never misses, its target never fails to return to his hand when thrown, never loses its power to crush whatever stands before it, and in this perfection lies a terrible trap. For when every problem can be solved with overwhelming force, the temptation to rely on violence becomes almost irresistible. Thor's relationship with violence is complex and troubling, for while he fights to protect the innocent, the act of fighting has itself become a need as fundamental as breathing. In the quiet moments between battles, when peace settles over the realms like snow, Thor grows restless, his mighty hands clenching and unclenching, as if seeking an enemy to strike down. He prowls the borders of Asgard like a caged wolf, his keen eyes scanning the horizon for signs of threat. And when no threats present themselves, he sometimes seeks them out, venturing into Jotunheim to hunt giants with an enthusiasm that disturbs even his fellow gods. The slaughter of giants has become more than duty for Thor. It has become a compulsion, a way of channeling the destructive power that threatens to consume him from within. He tells himself that every giant slain is a potential threat to Midgard eliminated. Every monster destroyed is a village saved. Every enemy crushed beneath Mjolnir's weight is a family that will sleep safely in their beds. But in the darkest corners of his mind, Thor knows that he kills not just from duty, but from need, from a hunger for violence that grows stronger with each victory rather than weaker. There was the time he encountered the giant Ragnarok in single combat, a battle that began with boasting and threats, but escalated into something far more terrible. Ragnarok, the strongest of all giants, had challenged Thor to a duel that would determine the fate of both their peoples, and the Thunder God had accepted with an eagerness that should have given him pause. The battle that followed shook the foundations of Midgard itself, two titans of strength, trading blows that cracked mountains and boiled seas. When Mjolnir finally crushed Ragnar's skull, splitting it like an overripe fruit, Therese felt not satisfaction, but a hollow emptiness, a brief moment of silence in the constant storm of his rage. The giant's death had solved nothing, prevented no wars, saved no lives. It had simply fed the beast of violence that lived within the Thunder God's breast, giving it strength for the next battle, the next killing, the next moment when the hammer would taste blood. But perhaps more troubling than Thor's relationship with violence is his growing isolation from the very people he has sworn to protect. Mortals pray to him for protection. They build temples in his honor and offer sacrifices to gain his favor. Yet when he walks among them, they flee in terror from the aura of barely contained destruction that surrounds him like a second skin. Children hide behind their mothers' skirts when they catch sight of his massive frame. And even brave warriors find excuses to be elsewhere when the Thunder God passes through their halls. This isolation is not born from malice or cruelty on Thor's part, but from the simple fact that he has become something beyond mortal understanding, a force of nature, given divine form, a walking storm that can never truly be tamed or domesticated. His very presence reminds mortals of their fragility, of how easily their lives could be snuffed out by powers beyond their control. And while they are grateful for his protection, they cannot help but fear the protector himself. Even among the gods of Asgard, Thor has begun to feel the weight of separation. For his fellow deities increasingly see him not as a friend and companion, but as a weapon to be pointed at their enemies, a blunt instrument to be wielded when subtlety fails and diplomacy proves insufficient. Odin values him for his strength and loyalty, but the Allfather's conversations with his son have become increasingly tactical, focused on threats to be eliminated and battles to be won rather than the deeper concerns that occupy a god's immortal existence. The other gods respect Thor's power but fear his temper. They seek his aid in times of crisis, but avoid his company in times of peace, and slowly, inexorably, the Thunder God has found himself becoming what every warrior fears most. A stranger to his own people, beloved in legend, but lonely in life. This isolation has begun to change him in ways that even he does not fully understand, making him quicker to anger, more likely to see threats where none exist, more willing to use violence as the first solution rather than the last resort. There are nights when Thor stands alone on the battlements of Asgard, gazing out toward the darkness that lies beyond the realm of light, and wonders if perhaps he has become the very thing he has spent his existence fighting against. Not a giant in form, perhaps, but giant-like in his capacity for destruction, in his hunger for battle, in his growing disconnection from the gentler aspects of existence that give life meaning beyond mere survival. The thunder that follows his passage has begun to sound different to his own ears, less like the voice of divine power and more like the growl of a beast. that can never be satisfied, never be tamed, never be anything more than what it was created to be. He sees the fear in mortal eyes when they look upon him, sees the way even gods step aside when his temper flares, and he wonders if the price of being the protector has been the loss of his own humanity, his own capacity for peace, his own hope of being loved rather than merely feared. Yet still he fights, still he answers the calls for aid that echo across the 9 realms. Still he stands between civilization and chaos, with his hammer raised and his courage undiminished. But each battle leaves him a little more removed from the people he has sworn to protect, a little more lost in the storm of his own power. The shadow that follows Thor is not the darkness of evil, but the darkness of evil, but the darkness of duty carried to far of strength, exercised without wisdom of a heart that has learned to beat in rhythm with the drums of war and forgotten the gentler music of peace. In the end, Thor's tragedy is not that he has become a monster, but that he has become a lonely god, powerful beyond measure, yet increasingly unable to connect with the very beings whose lives give his own existence meaning. He is the thunder that announces the storm, the lightning that splits the sky, the hammer that never misses its mark. But he is also a being slowly drowning in his own legend, losing himself in the very role that has made him necessary to the survival of all he holds dear, Loki's web and the gods' complicity. In the tapestry of divine fate, there exists a thread darker than all the others, woven through every triumph and tragedy with such subtle skill that its presence is felt long before its nature is understood. This thread bears the name Loki, and to speak of him is to speak of paradox made flesh of a being who serves as both the gods' greatest ally and their most dangerous enemy, often in the same moment, sometimes with the same action. He is the blood brother of Odin, the companion of Thor, the silver-tongued solver of divine problems, yet also the architect of Asgard's greatest sorrows, the father of monsters, the spark that will kindle the flames of Ragnarok itself. But to understand Loki's darkness, one must first understand that he does not weave his web alone. For every strand of chaos he creates is anchored by the complicity of the gods themselves, held in place by their willingness to use his gifts when it suits their purposes, to benefit from his tricks when they serve divine interests, to turn a blind eye to his methods when they produce desired results. The gods of Asgard are not innocent victims of Loki's machinations. They are willing participants in a dance that will ultimately lead them all to destruction. Consider the building of Asgard's great wall, that massive fortification that stands as a symbol of divine power and security, yet was constructed through a bargain that revealed the gods' willingness to gamble with forces beyond their control. When a mysterious builder appeared before the gods, offering to construct an impregnable wall around their realm in exchange for the sun, the moon, and the hand of the beautiful goddess Freya in marriage, the gods found themselves faced with a proposition that seemed too good to refuse and too dangerous to accept. The builder claimed he could complete this monumental task in a single winter, working alone, save for his mighty stallion, Svaelfari, and as security for his promise, he was willing to forfeit all payment if he failed to finish the work by the first day of spring. To the gods, this seemed like an impossible task, a boast born of either madness or arrogance, and they saw in it an opportunity to gain a magnificent wall without having to pay the terrible price demanded. Yet even as they agreed to this bargain, some inner wisdom warned them that they were treading on dangerous ground. For the builder's confidence seemed too real, his stallion's strength too great, his progress on the wall too swift for comfort. As winter waned and the massive fortification neared completion, the gods realized with growing horror that they had bound themselves to a contract that would strip them of light itself and cost them one of their most beloved members. It was then that they turned to Loki, not with accusations or demands for justice, but with pleas for salvation, begging him to find some way to prevent the builder from completing his work without technically breaking the sacred oath they had sworn. The gods did not ask Loki to be honorable in his methods. They did not demand that he act with integrity or fairness. They simply wanted him to solve their problem by whatever means necessary, and in doing so, they made themselves accomplices to whatever dark deeds would follow. Loki's solution was characteristically clever and morally questionable. Transforming himself into a mare in heat, he lured away Svælfari during the crucial final night of construction, leading the stallion on a wild chase through the forests, while the builder worked frantically to complete his task alone. Without his supernatural steed, the builder could not finish the wall by the agreed deadline, and the gods were freed from their bargain through trickery rather than honor. But the consequences of this deception would echo through the ages in ways that none of them anticipated. The builder, revealed in his rage to be one of the mountain giants, was struck down by Thor's hammer for his presumption. Yet his death was only the beginning of the price that would be paid. For Loki, in his mare form, had spent that night in the wild with Svælfari, and from their union would be born Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse that would become Odin's mount, a creature of supernatural speed and endurance, whose very existence served as a constant reminder of the morally ambiguous methods the gods were willing to employ when their interests were at stake. The gods accepted Sleipnir, gladly seeing in the magnificent steed a valuable addition to their power, while conveniently ignoring the circumstances of his birth, the deception that had made his existence possible, the price in honor and integrity that had been paid to acquire him. They praised Loki's cleverness in solving their problem, while refusing to acknowledge their own role in creating the situation that required such a solution. And in doing so, they established a pattern that would repeat throughout their relationship with the trickster god. Time and again, the gods would find themselves in situations where conventional wisdom and honorable action seemed insufficient to protect their interests. And time and again, they would turn to Loki for solutions that they would never implement themselves, but were grateful to see implemented on their behalf. When treasures needed to be acquired through guile, when enemies needed to be defeated through trickery, when problems needed to be solved through methods that gods could not openly employ, Loki became their instrument, their scapegoat, their willing accomplice in deeds that they later preferred to forget. But perhaps no example of this divine complicity is more telling than their reaction to Loki's monstrous children, the offspring born from his union with the giantess Angrboda in the dark forests of Jotunheim. When prophecy revealed that these children, Fenrir, the wolf Jarmungandr, the world serpent, and Hel, the half-dead goddess of the underworld, would play crucial roles in the destruction of the gods, the Jir faced a moral choice that would define their character for all time. They could have chosen to treat these children with the love and guidance that might have turned them away from their prophesied path. They could have welcomed them into Asgard as family. They could have demonstrated that destiny is not immutable, and that even the children of chaos can choose their own fate. Instead, they chose fear over love, expediency over morality, and in doing so, They ensured that their own paranoid visions would become self-fulfilling prophecies. Jarmungandr was cast into the sea that surrounds Midgard, where his growth and rage transformed him into a monster whose movements would one day shake the very foundations of the world. Hel was banished to the realm of the dead, where her resentment festered in the cold darkness until she became a force of entropy that would welcome the destruction of those who had rejected her. And Fenrir, the mighty wolf whose only crime was being born of a union the gods disapproved of, was raised in Asgard under the pretense of love, but with the constant awareness that he was feared and unwanted. The gods told themselves that they were being wise, that they were protecting themselves from a prophesied threat, but in reality, they were creating the very enemies they feared through their own actions, their own prejudices, their own inability to see beyond the narrow confines of their self-interest. They used Loki's children as scapegoats for their own moral failings, treating them as monsters, not because of anything they had done, but because of what they might do, because of who their father was. Because it was easier to exile and imprison than to love and guide. And through it all, Loki watched as his children were torn from him and scattered across the 9 realms, saw the fear and hatred in the eyes of gods, who had once called him brother, felt the growing weight of resentment and rage that would eventually transform him from divine ally to cosmic enemy. The gods created their own nemesis through their treatment of him and his offspring, yet they would later blame him entirely for the darkness that grew from seeds they themselves had planted. The web that Loki weaves is indeed dark and complex, full of tricks and deceptions that will ultimately bring ruin to the gods. But every strand of that web is anchored in divine soil, held in place by the gods' own choices, their own moral compromises, their own willingness to use darkness in service of light. They made Loki what he became through their complicity, their convenience, their inability to maintain their own standards when those standards proved inconvenient to their desires. In the end, the gods of Asgard will face Ragnarok, not as innocent victims of Loki's malice, but as beings who helped weave the very web that will ultimately ensnare them all, participants in a tragedy of their own making, architects of a doom that they could have avoided if they had possessed the courage to choose love over fear, honor over expediency, moral clarity over convenient ambiguity. The shadow that Loki casts over the divine realm is matched by the shadow that the gods cast over themselves, and in that mutual darkness, the seeds of cosmic destruction grow ever stronger, nourished by the tears of rejected children and the blood of betrayed trust. The death of Baldr. A world darkens. There exists in the heart of every paradise a single point of perfect vulnerability, a place where all the light gathers and from which all warmth flows. And when that point is extinguished, the darkness that follows is not merely the absence of illumination, but the presence of something far more terrible. The knowledge that even the most beautiful things in existence are temporary, fragile, subject to the same laws of entropy that govern all creation. In Asgard, that point of perfect light bore a name that was itself like music, Baldr, the beautiful, the beloved, the god whose very presence seemed to make the world a brighter, kinder place. Baldr was not merely beautiful in the way that gods often are, possessed of supernatural grace and divine perfection. He was beautiful in a way that transcended physical appearance and touched something deeper in all who looked upon him. His beauty was that of sunrise after the longest night, of the first flower blooming after winter's end, of hope made manifest in divine form. When he laughed, the very air seemed to shimmer with joy when he spoke his words, carried the power to heal old wounds and mend broken hearts when he walked through the halls of Asgard. His footsteps left behind them a trail of peace that could calm even the angriest spirits. He was loved by all, not with the fearful reverence that gods often inspire in mortals, but with the pure, uncomplicated affection that one feels for the finest aspects of existence. His mother, Frigg, adored him with an intensity that bordered on obsession. His father, Odin, treasured him as the embodiment of everything the gods could be at their best. His wife Nanna loved him with a devotion that had become legendary even among beings accustomed to eternal romance. Even Loki, whose heart had grown cold toward so much of divine society, had once felt genuine warmth for Baldr, had once counted the beautiful god among the few beings whose company brought him unalloyed pleasure. But in the shadows of prophecy, darker truths were stirring. For Odin's ravens had brought whispers of dreams that haunted Baldr's sleep, visions of his own death that came to him night after night with growing clarity and intensity. These were not the ordinary nightmares that sometimes trouble even divine minds, but true dreams, glimpses of a future that seemed as fixed and immutable as the movement of the stars themselves. In these visions, Baldr saw himself struck down by treachery, saw the light fading from his eyes, while around him the gods wept and wailed and called upon powers that could not answer. When word of these dreams reached Frigg, the goddess was consumed by a terror that transcended rational thought, for she understood, as only a mother can, that sometimes the most vivid dreams are not fantasies but prophecies, windows into futures that have not yet arrived but are already written in the cosmic book of fate. Driven by love and desperation, she embarked upon a quest that would take her to every corner of creation, seeking from all things a promise that they would never harm her beloved son. Through the 9 realms she traveled, speaking to every creature, every object, every force of nature, begging for oaths that they would offer no harm to Baldr. Fire promised it would never burn him, water swore it would never drown him, iron vowed it would never cut him, stone pledged it would never crush him. From the mightiest giants to the smallest insects, from the grandest mountains to the tiniest pebbles, all things gave their word that Baldr would remain safe from their power. It was a monumental undertaking, a testament to both divine determination and maternal love. And when it was complete, Frigg believed she had woven around her son a protection so complete that nothing in all creation could breach it. Baldr himself seemed transformed by this cosmic blessing, moving through the world with a confidence born of absolute invulnerability, laughing at dangers that would terrify lesser beings, secure in the knowledge that the universe itself had sworn to protect him. The gods, delighted by this development, turned Baldr's invulnerability into a kind of divine entertainment, gathering in great assemblies to test the limits of his protection by hurling weapons and stones at him, watching with joy and amazement as every projectile either missed him entirely or bounced harmlessly away. It became a celebration of divine power, a demonstration of how the gods could bend the very laws of nature to protect what they loved most. And Baldr stood at the center of it all, like a figure from a dream, beautiful and untouchable and radiant with divine grace. But in the shadows, at the edge of these celebrations, Loki watched with eyes that had grown dark with resentment and pain, his heart poisoned by years of rejection and mistrust, his mind twisted by the knowledge of how the gods had treated his own children, how they had cast out his offspring as monsters, while celebrating the invulnerability of golden Baldr. The contrast was not lost on him. His children, innocent of any crime save their parentage, had been scattered and imprisoned and feared, while Baldr, beloved simply for existing, was protected by cosmic decree and celebrated by all, through careful questioning disguised as casual interest. Loki learned from Frigg the secret that would prove Baldr's undoing. In all her travels through the 9 realms, gathering oaths of protection for her son, she had overlooked one small plant, dismissing it as too young and weak to pose any threat. Mistletoe, that humble parasite that grows in the branches of greater trees, had seemed so insignificant that the goddess had not bothered to secure its promise, never imagining that something so small and seemingly powerless could become the instrument of cosmic tragedy. Armed with this knowledge, Loki's wounded heart conceived a plan that was both brilliantly simple and unutterably cruel. He fashioned a dart from mistletoe, working the innocent plant into a weapon that would be invisible to all the cosmic protections that surrounded Baldr. And then he sought out Baldr's blind brother, who stood apart from the celebrations, not from lack of love, but from inability to participate in the games that required sight to aim and throw. With words honeyed by false kindness, Loki offered to help join in the festivities, to guide his hand so that he too could honor his brother by testing the divine protection that made Baldr invulnerable. It was the trickster god, suggested only fitting that all of Baldr's brothers should participate in this celebration of his divine blessing, and he would be happy to serve as Acher's eyes, ensuring that the blind god's throw would strike true. Acher, grateful for what seemed like genuine thoughtfulness, accepted the mistletoe dart and allowed Loki to guide his aim, never suspecting that the weapon he held was the one thing in all creation that could breach his brother's protection. When he released the dart, it flew straight and true, guided by Loki's malice and powered by cosmic irony, striking Baldr in the chest with a force that seemed impossibly small yet proved devastatingly effective. The silence that followed was profound and terrible, the kind of silence that occurs when something fundamental about the nature of reality suddenly changes, when the laws that govern existence are revealed to be less absolute than they appeared. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Baldr stood motionless, the tiny dart protruding from his chest like an obscene joke, his beautiful face wearing an expression of surprise rather than pain. Then the light began to fade from his eyes, the divine radiance that had made him so beloved growing dim like a candle guttering in the wind. And the most beautiful of all gods crumpled to the ground, while around him the assembled deities erupted in cries of anguish that shook the very foundations of Asgard. The sound of their grief was like the breaking of crystal, like the last note of the most beautiful song ever sung, like the death of hope itself. Frigg's wail, when it came, contained within it all the sorrow that a mother's heart can hold, all the devastation of love betrayed by fate, all the rage of someone who has done everything possible to protect what matters most, only to watch it die anyway. She fell to her knees beside her son's body, her hands fluttering over the wound, as if her touch might somehow reverse what had been done, calling upon powers that had already proven insufficient to preserve what she treasured above all else. Odin's grief was quieter, but no less profound, for he had seen this moment in his visions, had known that it was coming, had been powerless to prevent it, despite all his wisdom and foresight. The Allfather stood like a statue carved from sorrow, his single eye fixed upon his fallen son, while his ravens circled overhead, their cries adding to the chorus of divine anguish that filled the air. But perhaps most terrible of all was the realization that slowly dawned upon the assembled gods as they processed what had occurred. This was not merely the death of one beloved deity. It was the beginning of the end of everything they had built, everything they cherished, everything they believed about their own permanence and power. Baldr's death was the first crack in the dam that held back the flood of Ragnarok, the initial note in a symphony of destruction that would ultimately consume them all. For if Baldr, the most beloved and protected of all gods, could be struck down by treachery and deceit, what safety could any of them claim? If the cosmic oaths that had sworn to protect him could be circumvented by something as simple as an overlooked plant, what meaning did any of their protections possess? The death of Baldr revealed the fundamental fragility that lay beneath all their power, the truth that even gods are subject to forces beyond their control, that even the most perfect paradise contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. As the reality of their loss settled upon them like a shroud, the gods began to understand that they were no longer dwelling in the golden age of their power, but in the twilight that precedes the final darkness. That Baldr's death was not an ending, but a beginning, the first movement in a dance that would culminate in the destruction of everything they held dear. The beautiful god's body lay before them like a prophecy written in flesh and blood, a message from fate itself that their time was ending and that all their wisdom, all their strength, all their divine will could not alter what was written in the stars and in the shadows at the edge of their grief. Loki watched the fruits of his revenge ripen into something far more bitter than he had anticipated, for he had sought to wound the gods who had rejected him and his children, but he had instead wounded himself more deeply than any external blow could have achieved. The sight of Baldr's lifeless form, the sound of divine anguish filling the air, the knowledge that he had been the instrument of this cosmic tragedy, these things carved themselves into his heart like brands, marking him forever as the one who had brought darkness into paradise, who had proven that even the most beautiful things must die. The death of Baldr was indeed the moment when the world darkened, but it was also the moment when the gods truly understood the price of existence. The cost of caring deeply for anything in a universe where entropy always wins, where beauty is always temporary, where even divine love cannot protect what it treasures most from the inexorable march of fate. In losing their most beloved, they gained their deepest wisdom, but it was a wisdom that brought no comfort, only the terrible clarity that sometimes accompanies the most profound losses, the understanding that comes when all illusions fall away and only truth remains. Doomed prophecies and the weight of fate. In the cold depths of Odin's wisdom, purchased with blood and sacrifice and endless sorrow, there lies a truth more terrible than any monster, more devastating than any weapon, more final than any death. The knowledge that some things cannot be changed, that some futures are written in letters of fire across the cosmic sky, that prophecy is not warning, but pronouncement, not possibility, but certainty, dressed in the language of time. The Allfather, who traded his eye for sight beyond sight, who hung himself from the world tree to learn the secrets of the runes, who consulted with spirits and seers and the ancient dead, had gained the most bitter gift of all, the ability to see clearly the doom that approached his people, combined with the complete inability to prevent it. This was the weight that Odin carried through every moment of his existence, the burden that made his laughter hollow and his victories temporary, the shadow that fell across every joy and turned every triumph to ash in his mouth. He had seen Ragnarok in visions so vivid they seemed more real than waking life, had watched the final battle play out in dreams that came to him night after night with the regularity of breathing, had witnessed his own death and the death of everything he had built so many times that the images were seared into his consciousness like brands. The prophecies came to him from many sources, each one confirming and expanding upon the others until the shape of the future became as clear and immutable as the mountains themselves. The Volva, the wise women who could see beyond the veil of present time, spoke to him in voices heavy with sorrow about the wolf that would swallow the sun, the serpent that would poison the sky, the fire that would consume the world tree itself. The Norns, those ancient beings who weave the threads of fate, showed him the pattern they were creating, each strand placed with deliberate precision to form a tapestry of destruction that no power could unravel. Even the dead brought him news of what was to come, speaking from beyond the grave about the gathering shadows. The armies mustering in the realm of the dishonored, the preparations being made for a war that would surpass all previous conflicts in its scope and finality. Every source confirmed what his own visions had already revealed, that the gods were doomed, that Asgard would fall, that everything they had built over countless ages would crumble into ruin and ash. Yet perhaps the cruelest aspect of Odin's gift of prophecy was not simply knowing that doom approached, but understanding with crystalline clarity exactly how each step toward that doom would unfold, seeing how every action taken to prevent the prophecies would only serve to fulfill them more completely. He had learned the identity of his killer, Fenrir, the great wolf who was Loki's child, grown mighty on divine fear and resentment. He knew the manner of his death, devoured alive while the world burned around him, his wisdom and power proving as ephemeral as morning mist when faced with the fury of a beast raised on betrayal. Thor's fate was equally clear in the Allfather's visions. The thunder god would face Jormungandr, the world serpent, in single combat at the end of all things, and though Thor would emerge victorious from that battle, the victory would cost him his life, the serpent's poison claiming the strongest of the gods mere moments after he struck the killing blow. The god who had protected Midgard from giants and monsters would himself fall to a monster's venom, dying not in glorious battle but in agonizing dissolution, his mighty frame racked by toxins that no divine constitution could resist. The knowledge of these fates weighed upon Odin like chains forged from despair itself, for he understood that his very efforts to prevent them were part of the cosmic pattern that would bring them to pass. Every precaution he took, every defensive measure he implemented, every attempt to change the future only served to ensure that the future would unfold exactly as prophesied. It was a trap more perfect than any ever devised by mortal minds, a prison built from the gods' own desperate desire to survive. Consider how the prophecy of Fenrir's threat led directly to its fulfillment, warned that the wolf would grow to become Odin's killer. The gods chose to raise him in Asgard, where they could watch him, hoping that love and care might turn him from his prophesied path. But their fear was stronger than their love, their suspicion more powerful than their affection, and Fenrir grew up knowing himself to be both welcomed and feared, cherished and despised, protected and threatened. As the wolf matured, growing larger and stronger with each passing day. The gods' unease transformed into active terror, and they began to plot ways to contain the threat he represented. They told themselves they were being prudent, that they were protecting themselves and all the 9 realms from a prophesied danger. But in reality, they were ensuring that their own paranoid visions would become self-fulfilling prophecies. The binding of Fenrir became inevitable once the gods allowed fear to overcome wisdom. Once they chose to see him as a monster rather than as a being capable of choice and growth. They commissioned the dwarves to forge Gleipnir, a chain so fine it seemed like silk, yet so strong it could hold a god, and they tricked the great wolf into allowing them to bind him with it, claiming it was merely a test of strength, a game among friends. But Fenrir was not fooled by their deceptions. His keen intelligence had already perceived the change in how the gods regarded him. The way their smiles had become forced, their words calculated, their affection tainted with barely concealed dread. He agreed to be bound only after Tyr, the god of war and justice, placed his hand in the wolf's mouth as surety that the binding was indeed temporary, that it would be removed once the test was complete. When the gods revealed their true intention, when they made clear that the binding was permanent, and that Fenrir would remain chained until the end of time, the wolf's reaction was swift and decisive. He bit down, severing Tyr's hand at the wrist, and ensuring that the god of justice would forever bear the mark of divine injustice, of oaths broken and trust betrayed. In that moment, any possibility that Fenrir might choose a different path vanished forever, for the gods had proven themselves to be exactly what the prophecies claimed they were, beings so consumed by fear that they would betray their own principles to preserve their lives. The irony was not lost on Odin, whose supernatural sight allowed him to see the cosmic implications of every choice, every action, every moment of moral compromise. In trying to prevent Fenrir from becoming their enemy, the gods had ensured that he would become their enemy in attempting to avoid their prophesied doom. They had taken the exact steps necessary to guarantee that doom would come to pass. The Allfather watched this tragedy unfold with the helpless clarity of one who knows how a story ends, but cannot alter its telling, who understands the moral of the tale, but is powerless to change its outcome. The same pattern repeated itself with Loki's other children, with the god's treatment of the trickster himself, with every major decision that shaped the relationship between Asgard and its enemies. Each time the gods acted from fear rather than wisdom, each time they chose expedience over justice, each time they allowed their paranoia to override their better nature, they took another step down the path that led inexorably toward Ragnarok. Odin could see it all with painful clarity, how their exile of Jormungandr would transform a potentially manageable threat into a world-ending monster, how their banishment of hell would create an enemy in the realm of the dead who would one day welcome their destruction, how their repeated betrayals of Loki would eventually drive him past the point where reconciliation remained possible. The Allfather watched his fellow gods make choice after choice that brought their doom closer, and though he sometimes tried to guide them toward different paths, he knew with prophetic certainty that his efforts were doomed to failure. For the gods, like all beings, were trapped within their own natures, bound by the same laws of character and consequence that govern all existence. They could no more choose to act against their fundamental selves than the sun could choose to rise in the west, than water could choose to flow uphill, than fire could choose to burn cold. Their fear, their pride, their inability to see beyond their own immediate interests. These things were as fixed and immutable as the stars themselves, and no amount of prophetic warning could alter what they were destined to become. This was perhaps the most crushing aspect of Odin's wisdom, the understanding that consciousness of fate does not grant power over fate, that seeing clearly does not enable one to change what is seen, that perfect knowledge is often indistinguishable from perfect helplessness. The Allfather was like a man trapped in a burning building who could see every detail of how the fire would spread, but possessed no means to extinguish it. Who could predict with absolute accuracy which beams would fall and when, but lacked the power to shore them up? Yet, even in the face of this cosmic hopelessness, Odin continued to prepare for the final battle, gathering heroes in Valhalla, seeking new sources of wisdom, forging alliances and weapons and strategies that he knew would ultimately prove insufficient. His preparation was not born from hope but from duty, not from belief in victory but from acceptance of responsibility, not from denial of fate but from determination to meet that fate with dignity intact. The weight of prophecy had taught him something that perhaps only gods can truly understand, that sometimes the greatest heroism lies not in winning but in fighting, not in changing fate but in facing it unflinching, not in escaping doom but in meeting doom with courage undiminished by the certainty of defeat. The Allfather would ride to Ragnarok, knowing exactly how the battle would end, knowing that his wisdom would prove insufficient, his power inadequate, his sacrifices meaningless in terms of final outcome. Yet he would ride nonetheless, because that is what gods do when the universe demands heroes, and heroes are all that remain. Ragnarok, twilight of the gods, the end, when it finally comes, arrives not with the sudden shock of lightning, but with the slow inevitability of winter, creeping across the 9 realms like darkness, spreading across the sky, touching everything with frost that will never thaw, with silence that will never break, with shadows that will never lift. This is Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the final song that the universe has been composing since the moment of its birth. Each note carefully placed, each harmony precisely arranged, each discord deliberately crafted to create a symphony of ending that is both terrible and beautiful, both devastating and strangely peaceful. The signs have been gathering for years, like storm clouds on the horizon, each one a harbinger of the catastrophe to come, each one a verse in the great poem of destruction that the Norns have been weaving since time began. The sun grows pale and cold, its light failing as the wolf's skull finally catches and devours it, plunging the world into a darkness that is not the gentle darkness of night, but the absolute darkness of ending of light, dying forever. The moon, too, falls victim to its pursuer, haughty, and with its death, the tides themselves grow still. The rhythms that have governed ocean and blood and breath since the beginning of time finally falling silent. Earthquakes shake the foundations of the world, not the ordinary tremors that mark the earth's restless sleep, but great convulsions that speak of fundamental structures coming apart, of the very bones of existence cracking under the weight of cosmic change. Mountains crumble like sand castles, their ancient peaks toppling into valleys that have held them for millennia, while forests that have stood since the world was young burst into flame that consumes not just wood and leaf, but the very essence of growth itself. From the sea rises Jormungandr, the world serpent, Loki's monstrous child, grown to encompass the circumference of Midgard itself. His massive coils churning the waters into poison that rises like deadly mist to corrupt the very air. His movement, as he drags himself onto land, causes tidal waves that crash across continents, drowning cities and kingdoms, washing away the works of mortals and gods alike, as if they were nothing more than children's drawings in sand. The great wolf Fenrir breaks free at last from the chains that have bound him since the day the gods betrayed their own promise, the day they chose fear over honor and in doing so sealed their fate. The breaking of Gleipnir is not the snapping of mere bonds, but the shattering of cosmic law itself. The moment when the universe acknowledges that the time for mercy, for second chances, for hope itself has finally passed. Fenrir's howl, as he stretches his mighty limbs, echoes across all the realms, a sound of pure rage and pain and terrible joy at freedom finally achieved. But perhaps most ominous of all is the ship that sails from the realm of the dishonored dead, Naglfar, constructed from the fingernails and toenails of corpses, crewed by those who died without glory, without honor, without the chance to prove their worth in battle. At its helm stands Loki himself, finally free from the torments that the gods devised for him. After Baldr's death, his face transformed by centuries of suffering into something that might once have been divine, but has become something far more terrible, far more implacable than simple hatred. The armies that gather for this final battle are unlike any that have ever assembled in the history of the cosmos, for this is not merely a conflict between rival nations or competing philosophies, but the ultimate confrontation between order and chaos, between the forces that create and preserve and the forces that unmake and destroy. On one side stand the gods of Asgard, led by Odin on his eight-legged steed, their armor gleaming despite the darkness, their weapons sharp despite the certainty of defeat, their faces grim but determined as they ride toward a battle they know they cannot win. Beside them march the Einherjar, the chosen dead who have feasted in Valhalla since their mortal deaths, heroes gathered from across the ages to fight in this final conflict, their earthly disputes and rivalries forgotten in the face of cosmic necessity. They are magnificent in their courage, these mortal souls who have been granted the chance to stand alongside gods in the ultimate battle, yet their magnificence is tinged with the tragic knowledge that even heroism has its limits, that even the greatest warriors must sometimes face opponents beyond their strength to overcome. On the other side comes an army that defies comprehension, a host of giants and monsters and beings of chaos that have been gathering in the shadows since the world began, waiting for this moment when the bonds that held them would finally break, when the laws that restrained them would finally fail. They pour across the rainbow bridge Bifrost like a tide of darkness made manifest, their passage causing the great bridge to crack and groan under the weight of so much concentrated malevolence. At the center of it all stands Surtur, the fire giant whose blazing sword has been forged for this moment alone, whose very presence causes the air to shimmer with heat that speaks not of warmth but of annihilation, of a fire that burns not to purify but to utterly consume. He is more than a warrior, more than a destroyer. He is the physical manifestation of entropy itself, the cosmic force that ensures all things must end, all structures must fall, all stories must reach their final chapter. The battle that follows transcends mortal understanding of conflict, for this is not merely warfare, but the universe tearing itself apart, the fundamental forces of existence engaging in a struggle that shakes the very foundations of reality. Gods clash with giants in single combat that reshapes continents. Heroes face monsters in duels that last for days. The very elements themselves seem to take sides as fire and ice and storm and earthquake join the fray. Odin rides toward his prophesied encounter with Fenrir, the Allfather's spear, Gungnir gleaming in his hand like captured starlight. His ravens circling overhead in patterns that speak of endings and beginnings, of cycles completing themselves, and new cycles yet to be born. He knows how this confrontation will end, has seen it in visions countless times, yet he rides forward nonetheless, driven, not by hope of victory, but by the understanding that some things must be done, regardless of outcome, that honor sometimes demands sacrifice, even when sacrifice serves no practical purpose. The great wolf awaits him, with jaws that could swallow mountains, eyes that burn with the accumulated hatred of centuries of imprisonment, a hatred that has grown beyond personal resentment into something cosmic in its scope and intensity. When they meet, God and wolf, father figure and abandoned child, the collision of their conflict sends shockwaves through all the realms, a sound like the breaking of the world itself. The battle is brief but absolute, ending as prophecy decreed it must. Fenrir's jaws close around the Allfather, swallowing the god who sacrificed everything for wisdom, who gave up eye and comfort and peace for the terrible gift of seeing clearly. Odin's death is not the heroic end that bards might sing, but the fulfillment of cosmic law, the payment of a debt that was incurred the moment the gods chose to bind the wolf rather than trust him, to fear him rather than love him. Yet even in death, the Allfather achieves a final act of defiance for his son Vidar, the silent god whose thick shoe was crafted for this moment alone, steps forward to avenge his father's death, placing his foot upon Fenrir's lower jaw, and with his hands tearing the great wolf's head apart, ending the threat that has loomed over the gods since the day they first looked upon Loki's children with fear rather than wonder. Meanwhile, across the battlefield, Thor faces his own prophesied doom in the form of Jormungandr, the world serpent whose poison breath turns the very air into a weapon of mass destruction. The thunder god's hammer Mjolnir crashes again and again against the serpent's armored scales, each blow sending tremors through the earth, each impact accompanied by lightning that illuminates the chaos surrounding them in stark, terrible detail. This is the battle that Thor was born for. The confrontation that gives meaning to all his previous victories, all his endless struggles against the forces of chaos and destruction. His red beard is matted with sweat and blood, his armor cracked and scorched, his mighty frame pushed to its absolute limits as he faces an opponent whose size and strength match even his own divine power. The killing blow, when it comes, is everything the prophecies promised, and more. Mjolnir, thrown with all the force that the god of thunder can muster, strikes Jormungandr between the eyes, crushing the serpent's skull and sending its massive body crashing to the earth with such force that the impact creates new mountain ranges. Yet, victory tastes like ash in Thor's mouth. For even as the world's serpent dies, its final breath releases a cloud of poison so concentrated, so virulent, that not even divine constitution can resist its effects. Thor takes 9 steps away from his fallen enemy, 9 steps that carry him further from the battlefield, but closer to his own ending. And then the poison claims him, dropping the mightiest of the gods to his knees as toxins burn through his veins like liquid fire. His death is not the glorious end in battle that he might have chosen. but the slow dissolution of a body that has endured too much, fought too hard, carried too great a burden for too long. All across the battlefield, similar scenes play out as gods and giants, heroes and monsters, the forces of order and chaos engage in their final dance. Frey falls to Surtur's flaming sword, the god of fertility and growth, consumed by the fire that will soon devour all things. Tyr, the one-handed god of justice, meets his end, facing Garm, the hound that guards the gates of the underworld. Their mutual destruction serving as a final testament to the price that justice demands from those who would uphold it. Loki himself faces Heimdall, the guardian of the Rainbow Bridge, in a confrontation that brings their ancient enmity to its ultimate conclusion. These two beings, once friends, now enemies, die in each other's arms, their final battle serving as a microcosm of the larger tragedy that has consumed the gods, the way that love can curdle into hatred, that trust can transform into betrayal, that even the bonds of blood and friendship can be severed by the sharp edge of destiny. As the battle reaches its climax, as the last of the great champions fall, and the last of the ancient enemies claim their final victories, Surtur raises his blazing sword high above his head and brings it down upon the world tree itself. Yggdrasil, the cosmic axis around which all the 9 realms have revolved since the beginning of time. The great tree, which has weathered countless storms and supported countless worlds, finally yields to the fire. Giant's blade, its mighty trunk splitting, its vast branches toppling its death, marking the end not just of this battle but of this entire cycle of existence. The fire that follows is unlike any that has ever burned, for it consumes not just matter but memory, not just substance but story, not just things but the very concepts that gave those things meaning. It sweeps across all the realms like a tide of absolute ending, reducing gods and giants, heroes and monsters, mountains and seas, all the accumulated history of cosmic ages to nothing more than ash and emptiness and the terrible silence that follows when even echo dies. Yet in this moment of ultimate destruction, there is also a strange beauty, a peace that comes from completion, from the understanding that all stories must end, that all songs must reach their final note, that all dances must take their final step. The twilight of the gods is not merely an ending, but a transformation. Not just death, but the prelude to rebirth. Not the last chapter, but the turning of the page to a story that has not yet been written, but waits to be born from the ashes of what came before. After the ashes, echoes beyond Ragnarok, in the profound silence that follows the end of everything, where the ashes of gods and giants lie mingled with the dust of shattered worlds. Something stirs that is neither memory nor dream, but something richer than both. Something that speaks to the eternal nature of existence itself, to the truth that endings are always also beginnings, that death contains within itself the seeds of new life, that even in the most complete destruction, something always survives to carry the story forward into whatever comes next. The world that emerges from the ashes of Ragnarok is not the same world that perished in fire and flood and cosmic violence, yet it is not entirely different either, for it carries within itself the essence of what came before, transformed and purified but not erased, renewed but not forgotten. This is the great mystery that the Norse understood better than most, that creation and destruction are not opposites but partners in the eternal dance of existence, that every ending makes possible a new beginning, that every death nourishes the soil from which new life will grow. From the waters that covered the burning earth, new land rises like the first breath of a newborn child, green and fertile and pregnant with possibilities that have not yet been imagined, let alone realized. The sun devoured by the wolf's skull in the darkness of Ragnarok's night is succeeded by her daughter, a new sun that shines with light that is both familiar and strange, carrying forward the legacy of illumination, while bringing its own unique radiance to the reborn world. The great tree Yggdrasil, which fell beneath Surtur's flaming sword in the final moments of the old age, puts forth new shoots from its ancient roots, for even the cosmic axis cannot be utterly destroyed. Even the pillar that supports all reality carries within itself the power of regeneration. The new tree that grows from these primordial roots is both the same tree and a different tree, connected to what came before, yet free to grow in directions that the old tree never explored. In the hidden places where the fire could not reach, in the secret spaces between moments, between heartbeats, between thoughts, life has persevered in forms both divine and mortal. To humans and Rosser, whose names mean simply life and life's yearning, emerge from their hiding place within Yggdrasil's protective embrace, blinking in the light of the new sun like children waking from the deepest sleep. They are the Adam and Eve of this renewed world, the progenitors of whatever human civilization will rise from the ashes of the old. But they are not alone in this reborn realm, for some of the gods to have survived the conflagration that claimed their elders, their fathers, their former selves. Vidar, the silent god, whose thick shoe tore apart Fenrir's jaws, walks through the new world with the measured pace of one who has seen endings and beginnings, both who understands that survival sometimes means bearing witness, carrying forward the memory of what was lost, so that its lessons might guide what is to come. Born for the sole purpose of avenging Baldr's death, finds in this new world a chance to discover who he might be when vengeance is no longer necessary, when the purpose that defined his existence has been fulfilled, and he is free to choose his own path, his own meaning, his own reason for being. Beside him walks Vidar, and together they represent the continuation of divine presence in the world, the understanding that godhood itself has not died, but has transformed, adapted, evolved to meet the needs of a reality that is both ancient and utterly new. Most remarkable of all is the return of Baldr himself, the beautiful god whose death marked the beginning of the end, whose loss cast the first shadow across the golden halls of Asgard. He emerges from the realm of the dead, not as a pale shadow of his former self, but renewed, reborn, carrying with him the wisdom that comes from having passed through death and emerged on the other side. With him comes his brother, Hr, the blind god whose hand cast the fatal dart, and in their reunion there is forgiveness that transcends understanding, love that overcomes even the deepest wounds. Together, these survivors of the cosmic catastrophe gather in the place where Asgard once stood, and there they find something that should not exist, something that speaks to powers greater than even the fire that consumed the world. Gladsheim, the great hall of the gods, standing intact among the ruins like a promise kept, like hope made manifest, like a reminder that some things are too essential to the nature of existence to be utterly destroyed. In this hall they sit together and speak of the old days of the gods who fell and the giants who perished, of the heroes who fought bravely and the monsters who served their purpose in the great drama that has finally concluded. Their words are not bitter with loss, but rich with understanding, for they have learned what their predecessors never quite grasped, that the universe is not a tragedy to be endured, but a story to be told, retold, transformed through the telling into something that serves the needs of each new age. They speak of Odin, the Allfather, whose quest for wisdom led him down paths so dark that even divine eyes could barely see their way. And in their speaking, his memory becomes not a cautionary tale, but a reminder of the price that knowledge sometimes demands, the sacrifice that wisdom sometimes requires. They remember his ravens, Hugin and Munin, and wonder if perhaps somewhere in this new world, new ravens fly with news of new mysteries, new secrets, new truths waiting to be discovered by minds brave enough to seek them. They recall Thor's mighty hammer and his endless battles against the forces of chaos, and in their remembering, they understand that his struggles were not failures, but preparations, not defeats, but training for the final victory that his death, in some strange way, represented. The thunder god's sacrifice taught them that sometimes the greatest triumph lies not in personal survival, but in ensuring that what matters most continues beyond the span of any individual life, even divine life. Even Loki is remembered with something approaching understanding, if not forgiveness, for they have learned that chaos serves creation, that destruction enables renewal, that even betrayal can sometimes serve purposes larger than those who perpetrate it can comprehend. The trickster god's role in bringing about Ragnarok was terrible, but also necessary, for without ending, there can be no beginning without death. There can be no true rebirth without the courage to let go of what was there, can be no possibility of what might be. The new world spreads out before these survivors like an unwritten book, its pages blank and waiting for the stories that will fill them, the legends that will be born from the deeds of beings yet to come. It is a world purified by fire, renewed by flood, made clean by the complete destruction of everything that came before. Yet it is also a world enriched by memory, guided by the lessons learned in ages past, shaped by the understanding that comes from having witnessed both the heights of divine glory and the depths of cosmic catastrophe. In this renewed realm, the old divisions between God and giant, between order and chaos, between creation and destruction, have lost much of their meaning. For the survivors have learned that these were never truly opposites, but different aspects of the same fundamental truth, that existence requires both stability and change, both preservation and transformation, both the force that builds and the force that tears down, so that new building might begin. The mortals who will inherit this world will know stories of the gods who came before, tales passed down through the survivors, and the memories they carry. But these stories will not be mere entertainment or simple moral instruction. They will be guidebooks for navigating the complexities of existence, maps for finding meaning in a universe that is both beautiful and terrible, wise and foolish, creative and destructive, all at the same time. As the new sun sets on this first day of the renewed world, painting the sky in colors that have never been seen before, yet somehow feel familiar to eyes that remember other sunsets in other ages, the survivors of Ragnarok prepare for sleep that will be restful rather than haunted, peaceful rather than troubled by prophetic dreams of doom. For they have learned the greatest secret of all, that every ending contains within itself the promise of a new beginning, that every death makes possible a new birth, that every twilight is followed by a new dawn, even when that dawn must wait for the turning of cosmic ages to finally break across the horizon of possibility. This is the true meaning of Ragnarok, not merely the death of gods, but their transformation, not simply the end of one world, but the beginning of another. Not just the conclusion of an old story, but the opening chapter of a tale that has not yet been told, but waits in the silence between one heartbeat and the next, in the pause between one breath and the next, in the moment of perfect stillness that exists between the end of one song and the beginning of another. The shadows remain, closing reflections. And so we find ourselves here, in the quiet moments after the great storm has passed, after the thunder has faded to whisper, and the lightning has gentled to the soft glow of distant memory, sitting in the peaceful darkness that follows the telling of tales that are too large for any single voice to contain, too deep for any single mind to fully comprehend, too ancient for any single lifetime to witness in their entirety. The myths we have walked through together, like footprints in snow that will melt with the coming of spring, were never truly about gods and giants, heroes and monsters, cosmic battles and world-ending fires. They were about us, about the shadows we cast and the light we carry, about the choices we make when faced with the impossible complexity of existence. What does it mean, we might wonder, as we settle back into the comfortable certainty of our own moment, our own breath, our own heartbeat, to have spent these hours in the company of beings whose divine nature amplified rather than diminished their essential humanity? What wisdom can we glean from gods who were powerful enough to shape worlds, yet vulnerable enough to be undone by their own fears, their own desires, their own inability to see beyond the narrow confines of their immediate needs? Perhaps the greatest lesson that Odin's sacrifice teaches us is not that knowledge is worth any price, but that some knowledge comes with costs so profound that the knowing changes the knower into something unrecognizable, that there exists a point beyond which wisdom and despair become indistinguishable from each other. The Allfather's single eye, gazing out from these ancient stories into our own troubled times, reminds us that the desire to know everything, to control everything, to predict everything can become a prison more confining than ignorance, more isolating than solitude. Thor's mighty hammer, swinging through these tales with the force of thunder itself, teaches us about the seductive nature of power, about how easy it becomes to see every problem as a nail when you possess the ultimate hammer, about the loneliness that waits for those who become so strong that others can relate to them only through fear or need, rather than love or friendship. The thunder god's tragedy is not that he was too weak to protect what he loved, but that he became so strong that he could no longer connect with it in any meaningful way. And Loki, the silver-tongued weaver of chaos and catalyst of change, shows us the shadow side of creativity, the darkness that lurks within the impulse to transform, to challenge, to refuse to accept the world as it is. His story is a reminder that intelligence without wisdom becomes cunning, that creativity without compassion becomes manipulation, that the desire to change everything can become indistinguishable from the desire to destroy everything. The death of Baldr, that moment when darkness first touched the golden halls of Asgard with its cold fingers, speaks to every parent who has ever feared for their child's safety, every lover who has ever tried to protect what they treasure most, every human being who has ever learned that beauty and fragility are often the same thing, seen from different angles. the beautiful goddess passing, reminds us that sometimes our very efforts to prevent loss ensure that loss will occur, that the attempt to shield what we love from all harm can become a form of harm itself. But perhaps most profound of all is the lesson of Ragnarok itself, that great ending that was also a beginning, that cosmic death that gave birth to cosmic renewal. In a world that often seems to be careening toward its own destruction, where the news cycles bring us daily reminders of how fragile our civilization has become, how quickly the structures we depend upon can crumble, how easily the order we take for granted can dissolve into chaos. The Norse understanding of endings becomes not a source of despair, but of strange comfort. For Ragnarok teaches us that destruction and creation are not enemies, but collaborators, that every ending makes space for a new beginning, that even the most complete catastrophe contains within itself the seeds of whatever will come next. The gods who died in that final battle did not die in vain, for their deaths made possible the birth of a new kind of existence, a new way of being divine, a new relationship between the forces of order and chaos that had been trapped in conflict for so long that they had forgotten how to dance together rather than tear each other apart. The survivors who emerged from the ashes of the old world carried with them not bitterness at what was lost, but gratitude for what was preserved. Not anger at the destruction they had witnessed, but wonder at the creativity that could build something beautiful from such complete devastation. They understood what we are only beginning to learn, that resilience is not about avoiding change, but about adapting to it, that survival is not about preventing endings, but about finding ways to carry forward what matters most when endings inevitably come. These ancient stories, born in the cold darkness of northern winters, when survival itself was a daily miracle, when the line between life and death was as thin as ice on a fast-moving stream, carry within themselves a wisdom that our warmer, safer, more comfortable world has perhaps begun to forget. They remind us that existence is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived, not a test to be passed, but an adventure to be experienced, not a burden to be endured, but a gift to be treasured, especially when that gift comes wrapped in darkness and tied with strings of sorrow. The shadows that these myths cast are long and deep, reaching across centuries and cultures to touch our own hearts with their ancient truths, their timeless insights, their ageless understanding of what it means to be conscious beings in a universe that is both magnificent and terrifying, both creative and destructive, both meaningful and absurd. They whisper to us in the quiet moments between waking and sleeping, in the pause between one breath and the next, in the silence that follows the last note of the most beautiful song. Listen, if you will, to that whisper, for it carries within itself the memory of what we were, the awareness of what we are, and the promise of what we might become. The gods are gone, transformed by their own stories into something that transcends individual existence. But their shadows remain, cast by the light of their deeds across the landscape of human consciousness, reminding us that we too are capable of both great creation and great destruction, both profound wisdom and profound folly, both divine love and divine wrath. As you return now to your own world, your own moment, your own life, with its particular joys and sorrows, its unique challenges and opportunities, carry with you the memory of gods who learned too late that power without love becomes tyranny, that wisdom without compassion becomes cruelty, that strength without humility becomes weakness. Remember that even divine beings were not immune to the consequences of their choices, that even immortal lives were shaped by the decisions made in moments of fear, anger, desperation, and hope. The northern sky still stretches above us, star-filled and infinite, beautiful and terrible in its vast indifference to our small human concerns, yet somehow made less lonely by the knowledge that others have looked up at those same stars and seen in them not emptiness but possibility, not abandonment but invitation, not the end of the story but the eternal beginning of stories yet to be told. The shadows remain, as shadows always do, cast by lights that have long since been extinguished, yet somehow still illuminating, still guiding, still whispering their ancient truths to any who have the patience to listen, the courage to hear, the wisdom to understand that in the end we are all gods and giants, heroes and monsters, creators and destroyers, walking together through the twilight of our own myths toward whatever dawn awaits us on the far side of our own endings, our own beginnings, our own eternal transformation from what we were into what we are becoming. Sleep now, if you will, and dream of thunder that speaks with a god's voice, of ravens that carry memory on black wings, of hammers that never miss their mark, of wolves that grow large on betrayal and small on love, of beauty so profound that even its death becomes a kind of birth, of endings so complete that they become beginnings, of shadows so deep that they become another kind of light, illuminating paths that can only be walked by those brave enough to embrace both darkness and dawn, both destruction and creation, both the weight of fate and the lightness of freedom that comes from accepting what cannot be changed while working to transform what can. The whisper beneath the northern sky continues, will always continue, carrying forward the echo of divine laughter and divine tears, of cosmic battles and cosmic peace, of love that transcends understanding and wisdom that transcends hope, reminding us that we are part of a story so large that no single telling can contain it, so beautiful that no single voice can sing it, so true that it must be lived, rather than simply heard, embodied, rather than simply understood, become, rather than simply believed. The gods await, patient as starlight, constant as shadow, eternal as the space between heartbeats, where all stories begin and all stories end, and all stories transform into something new, something wonderful, something that has never been told before, but has always been waiting to be born in the moment, when listener becomes teller, when dreamer becomes dream, when mortal touches immortal in the sacred darkness, where all myths are true and all truths are myths, and all endings are beginnings, dressed in the ancient clothing of night.